Welcome back, everyone. We're in, what is it, week 5? Week 5, and last week we read the book of Numbers. Tough stories. Tough stories in the book of Numbers. A lot of things that are very difficult to understand that, if I'm going to be intellectually honest, that I can't say that I can understand all of them. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with, I heard someone say, well, when asked about an atheist, what do you do with these difficult stories? And he said, well, it's like when I'm having a chicken dinner. I pick the good parts and I set the bones on the side of the plate, So come back to those later if I need to.
You're not suggesting you're going to do that today.
No, well, there's just some things that we don't have answers to because those answers will be given to us as we read on.
That's true. And some things we just don't understand.
Right. So we have to be really careful. Of course, the question we're asking here is, what are these stories telling us about the character of God? What does the things that He's doing and the way He's judging His people? What does it say about Him? And that's where we're starting from. So we're in the book of Numbers, referred to as the book of wanderings. It takes its name from the 2 census that God ordered. Numbering the men that were of eligible age for military service.
Right, so 20 and above.
20 and above. I guess the clear lesson I wrote down here is that we glean from this is sometimes you might need to pass through the wilderness before you get to the promised land.
And sometimes the promised land is right there, and you put yourself on a detour. And we've seen that in our own lives, and I'm sure other people have as well.
Yeah, because if you look at the map, the children of Israel could have made the journey from Sinai to the Promised Land in about a week. But 40 years they wandered in the wilderness because of various reasons that we'll get into. So let's start off with the census. I found this very interesting. So God calls for a census, and He tells Moses, I want you to go out and to see... how many men do you have that are of fighting age, 20 years of age and older?
Right.
So did God not know how many men were in the camp?
No, He knew. But apparently he wanted the people to know.
So this census was not for God, but for the people. And what do you think He was trying to say to them? What was the purpose of this?
Well, I think that they had just come out of Egypt. They're there. This is the beginning. And they're scared. They were slaves before, and now they are finally in charge of their own behavior, what's going to happen to them day to day, and all of these kind of things. And perhaps it's to say, you are a mighty number. If someone were to attack you, you have the numbers sufficient to provide. Because I think they didn't count the Levites, and they had over 600,000 men, plus women, plus children, plus the Levites. So they had likely over 1 million people.
Yeah, the 600,000, that would have been the men that would have been of fighting age, most likely between 20 and 50.
Yeah. I think it just said over 20.
Yeah, over 20.
Right.
But would not be counting the older men.
Right, or the younger.
So as you mentioned, the Levites. God said that the Levites are set aside here, and they're not to participate in any military service.
Right.
They're not to inherit land.
That's right.
That they are mine, and their inheritance is the fact that I have given them this special job.
That's right. I thought it was interesting, too, is that they didn't begin their service in the tabernacle until they were 30.
Yeah.
So everything else was 20, but they were 30.
Right. And so what's interesting also about that is that as Christ also didn't really start His ministry till He was, I believe it was 30 as well.
Yeah.
So what is it about the 30 that's so significant? Is it... Well, I can speak from my experience personally that do you have a lot of wisdom, or did you have a lot of wisdom when you were in your 20s?
No.
Yeah, and you're just...
Don't ask my parents, no.
I think at 30, though, you're just starting to get a clue that maybe I don't know everything.
That's right. And you've also had enough experiences to... not that what you think... as a 5-year-old, 10-year-old, whatever, 19, 20, isn't worthy. But now you've got both your ideas, and you've got some experience, and you have some hardships. And so you have a skill set to work with.
You might be able to bring you might be able to help somebody with an opinion or two. You've had enough life experience.
Right.
I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that.
Yeah.
So God warned. He's got a very pretty dire warnings. Don't let anyone come into this tabernacle that we've built. It's not a Levite. No strangers to come in there. So.
Well, I think the other thing along with the census is when he's doing that, it's also the organization, and later on we see that one of the prophets is looking out over the Israelites, and he can see that they are beautifully laid out. They have each tribe or tribe has a certain area where they're at. When they leave, they go in a certain order. They're organized. It looks nice.
They're God's representatives.
They're God's representatives.
Onward. And God, as we see through the story, I mean, the one common thread that I see all the way through here is that, well, he certainly holds his representatives to a high standard.
He does.
And he certainly looks with a very dim view on anyone who questions his representatives.
That is true.
So, moving on, how about the recipe to find out if your wife has been unfaithful?
Yes.
So, those of you who have read it, so there was a recipe, barley and oil and mixing together and a great deal of rituals and drinking of the bitter water. And if you were a man that was suspecting that your wife had been untrue to you, you could bring her before the priest, and you could create this this jealousy recipe. And if she drank it, that would manifest in the swollen thigh, the belly, and the thigh, and all of that. What's that all about? What do we do with that? Is that something we can use today?
Well, I don't think most people would bring... I mean, they would maybe go talk to their pastor or their minister or their priest, but they might not...
not use this particular recipe?
They probably don't use that particular recipe.
The thing that struck me then, was there a recipe for a woman to come in if she thought that her husband had been unfaithful?
That didn't mention that, did it?
Wasn't any mention of that. I thought that was interesting. So... the reason why
but I kind of wonder too here is if, in a way, this is a last, like the last step, because because for this family, inheritance is so important, and having children, and if the woman had been unfaithful, she would no longer have children because of this bitter water. Right, wasn't that? It caused her abdomen to swell, but then she couldn't have children.
It's implied.
Right, it's implied.
Yeah, it's implied.
So she, that would have destroyed her life. And I don't know if this is a way to warn. You will be found out.
It's hard to say. I don't know. But the reason why I bring this up is because many ministers are very ready to take things from the Old Testament and from the book of Numbers and apply them today and say these are the customs of the children of Israel and these should be the customs of Christians. But I don't remember ever hearing a sermon on this.
I've never heard one either.
Another thing that came up to me was how when God started directing the different tribes, the way they were to set up their camps, very neat and orderly.
Yeah.
Set up in a square, north, east, south, and west, and all of the families were to fly their standard or their banner, and clearly identifying them by who they were, by family, by coat of arms. So, basically something similar to that. God seems to like order and neatness.
He does.
And organization. Mm-hmm. I find that to be interesting. Is there something does that tell us anything about him? Because I
think it also life is easier when they're organized.
Yeah.
And for us too, life is easier when we're organized, because when our house feels like when we're hurrying about and we're in disarray, it's not nice. It's not a nice place to come. Mm-hmm. You can't relax. You can't find tools for when you need to get work done. The kitchen counter has too much. You can't cook a meal.
It brings a lot of stress and angst into your life.
It does.
Thing's interesting to me. So when I look at all this, when I'm trying to understand what does it say about the character of God, and I see that he really likes order and neatness and saying things. So when we work out into our forest, if we don't if we're not good stewards, if we don't look after it and keep the pruning done and the weeding out of the invasive trees, it's not an orderly forest.
Mm-hmm.
And often folks say, well, what you're doing by cutting and clearing and doing all these things, this is wrong. You should let the forest go back to its natural state, which is just the opposite of order, but it is very chaotic.
Well,
Is it God's plan for it to be this way, to be chaotic?
oh, for like life and forest and all that.
Yeah. Well, our life here on this fallen world.
Well, no, and I think in the Bible it also says He is a God of order, and He is a God of sense, and so no, we are, and we're also supposed to be stewards. I mean, I think that comes up later on with the story of Balaam, that you're supposed to take good care of your animals, right? And I think there's like
cooperating with God in this, because the interesting thing, we go back to Genesis, that Adam and Eve, they didn't just sit around and eat grapes out of each other's hands. They worked in the garden.
Right. They were stewards.
It was their job to train and to work in the garden and work in cooperation with God. But I think that the reason why things are the way they are and why the animal kingdom is so violent towards one another, I mean, a lot of people will make the argument, well, if God is good, then how do you justify the cat that toys with a mouse? It doesn't put it out of its misery, but it tortures it.
A burden for the sin is a burden for the whole world.
Yeah, it tortures the mouse, and I've seen their stories. Anyone who's lived with wolves will know that they'll kill for fun, not just for food. And so, if this is God's ideal plan, what type of a world is that? And what type of a God would create a cat that would toy and torture and torment a mouse instead of just putting it out of its misery? And the reason why I'm saying this is that this fallen world has degraded and does no longer resembles what God's ultimate plan was. Sin, the Bible tells us, the whole world groans and travails under the weight of sin, and it's not just us that suffer from this, but all of creation. The animals suffer, the forests suffer. All of the things are a perversion of God's what His ideal was.
Well, and I think so often too. Oftentimes we attempt to do what is best, but sometimes we make things worse. Kind of like when people sprayed pesticides everywhere and suddenly the water is polluted. Well, they were trying to kill the weeds, but the waters. Or in the forest, they're so good at putting out wildfires that now the fires don't come through the woods
all of those
prune.
things.
So I mean, oftentimes we make a lot of mistakes, and they're to our detriment rather than our benefit.
Yes, yeah. I think there's a lot of truth in that. So moving on, so the Israelites, they depart from Sinai. The people start to complain.
They do.
They start to grumble, and what they start by saying is that they start to look back to Egypt.
That's right.
And they start to look back with fondness. Oh, how wonderful it was. The grass is greener. How wonderful it was when we were back in Egypt. We had flesh to eat, i.e. meat. We had melons. We had all these things. And now all we have to eat is this horrible stuff they call manna, which means, what is it? What is it? And those of you who read the story knows that God provided the manna 6 days. It would fall in the evening like the dew, and they would gather it up, and they would grind it into it was a food for them that God was providing, and there was a lesson in that. What was the lesson? What is God trying to tell them by leading them out to a place that can produce no crops?
That He will take care of them.
Yes, that they're wholly dependent upon Him.
Well, and I think it's they will have everything they need. They will be provided for, and He will provide it for them. And it kind of reminds me a bit of, I was telling you about this story of this children who are entitled and taking everything away and just giving people what they need. So often when it's kind of like the house in chaos, if we have too much, it becomes a distraction and becomes chaotic when we have more than we need.
I think that's true. As you said, we were talking about this yesterday. I think the more things that we have and the more things that we acquire, the less satisfied we are.
Yeah. And that's not to say you shouldn't have things to have a good time with, or that you shouldn't have things you just enjoy.
Yeah.
But, right, it's
we've been talking about when we get done with this remodel of making some hard decisions and downsizing a lot of things in our life. We're talking just one example: ski gear. Oftentimes when we want to go skiing or something, we have so many things. We probably have a dozen hats and we have all types of gloves. Wouldn't it be simpler and easier and nicer just to get rid of all those things and have one nice pair of gloves and one nice hat and to simplify things? I often dream of when I think all of the things that we have to take care of and stack and find and storage and looking for places for, and we need to add another closet in here. Wouldn't it be nice to live in a 800 square foot home where everything had its place? It was very neat. It was very orderly. You had your pair of work boots. You had your pair of church shoes, maybe a pair of running shoes. It would make your life easier and simpler, wouldn't it?
It would.
But
there's also the hard, right, like extra stuff.
Yeah.
But there's when kids come over and we've got 8 different sizes of boots, it's fantastic because oftentimes kids don't have enough boots or sweatshirts, so it's nice to have those as well. But it's another thing that you have to manage.
It is fantastic for that one time a year when that may or may not happen. What it's not fantastic is the 364 days when you're having to deal with it.
It's true.
So I wonder if we shouldn't maybe take a hard look at that and think, well, it's the great. What is the greater good? What is the most important thing? We're getting off topic here. So they complain and they say they come to Moses and they're complaining. They don't like the food. They're tired of it. They say, we want some meat.
Right, and so they get meat, and it too falls from the sky. So
Moses goes to God and he's relaying the message and God he complies. Moses really starts to whine for the first time. And he says, God, what have I done to deserve you saddling me with these burdensome people?
I have 1 million people to take care of.
Why don't you just kill me? He even goes so far. Just kill me and I can be rid of this burden. And Moses said unto the Lord, Wherefore hast thou affected thy servant, and wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? Have I conceived all these people? Have I begotten them? He's blaming God for this. These were your people. These are not people. Why am I responsible for them? That thou should say unto me, Carry them in my bosom, as a nursing father beareth the suckling child into the land which thou swearest unto their father. Wherefore, or when should I have flesh to... So he's going on, and he's very upset about this. So Moses goes, so God relents, and what does he do?
Well, he sends quail from the sky.
The winds come up, and he sends quail, and not just a few quail.
A lot of quail.
But they're about 6 feet deep.
Right.
Of quail.
Too much. And the thing I find interesting is they have got meat. I mean, they've got livestock with them. But the Lord does not allow them to eat that meat. He still sends their food from the sky. He is still providing for them.
He's still providing for them. So the interesting thing here is so God relents, but he is he's not happy about it.
No.
And he says, okay, you want quail, I'll send you quail. And you won't eat it for 1 day. You won't eat it for 2, 5, 10, or 20. You'll eat it nothing but quail for a month until it makes you sick. So the tough thing here is, and then Moses comes and says, how am I going to feed all of these things? Was Moses showing faith when he said, how are we going to feed 600,000 men meat? We don't have enough animals. And when he's saying 600,000, it doesn't mean that was the total number of Israel. Right. He's just talking about the men. Yeah. Oftentimes when they did a census or a count, they didn't count the little ones. They didn't count the women, wives, children. It was so you can save 600,000. I mean, you could probably multiply that times 8.
Well, I think that Moses is feeling the burden of being the leader.
The burden of command.
The burden of command. He has great honor, but there is also a responsibility. And not only is there responsibility in caring for these people, but also in representing the Lord well. And he's not doing that so well right now.
So an interesting point here in 11. So Joshua comes on the scene, and Joshua obviously holds Moses in very high regard.
Right.
I don't know if Joshua was his right-hand man, But so God is, before the quail comes, he sends out a couple of guys, and they're prophesying among the camp.
Mm-hmm.
And Joshua gets wind of this, and he's jealous. He's jealous, and he comes to Moses, and he's complaining about this. He's like, do you know that these people are speaking for God? Aren't you the one that are supposed to speak for God? And it shows a lot. We're talking about the character of God, but it shows a lot about Moses' character. Was he threatened by this?
I don't think so.
What did he say?
I don't remember his exact words.
He says, well, only two? I wish that all of the children of Israel would prophesy. Am I not the meekest man who ever walked on the face of the earth?
I think it's funny that he wrote these books, but he keeps talking about how humble he is. Or maybe the Lord called him humble.
No, he did. He says of himself, I am the meekest man that ever lived. And at face value, that sounds like bragging, but I think we spoke about this before.
Yeah, we did.
That was a character that was despised back then. That would have been the equivalent of the President of the United States to get up and say, I am the least wise man that ever walked. I am the dumbest person that is in Washington, D.C. It wouldn't have been something that you would brag about. So the quail come. And the interesting thing is, so the quail come, and the people, it's hard to understand. I went and did a little bit of research on here, but the people went crazy, many of them, even to the point where it's, I don't have a scripture, I don't have a verse for this, but it appears that they maybe even just started tearing them and just eating them raw. Eating the blood, the things that were God commanded them never to eat, that the life was in the blood, that things should be done orderly.
So when they've got quail on their mouth, in their mouth, some of them are struck dead, and he has sent this plague.
Yeah, and it's not everyone. It says on the outskirts, and if you read in the footnotes and do a little research, I looked at some of the other translations. I think what they were doing, they had just lost their minds. I don't know. I don't have an answer for it. I just thought it was interesting. So we go to chapter 14.
Mm-hmm. Actually, chapter 12 I think is pretty interesting. Miriam gets leprosy. That's pretty harsh.
Is that chapter 12?
Yep. Yeah. Aaron and Miriam.
Okay, let's just go to that.
Okay.
Okay, so how about the story of Miriam and her and Aaron?
Right. So that's brother and sister of Moses.
Yes. So they start to feel a little slighted, and they think that they should be held in the same high regard and honor as Moses, and they start grumbling about it.
Right.
And what do they say? Does God not speak through us as well?
And he did. He used them.
Mm-hmm.
But very differently. They had different jobs.
And questioning Moses whether he really is, that they almost start to sound like they feel that they should be on equal footing, that they should be held in the same high regard that Moses is. So what happens from this?
Well, poor Miriam gets leprosy. And Aaron and Moses feel just awful about it. And it shows how kind.
She doesn't just get leprosy, God inflicts her with leprosy.
Right.
Which was, of all things back then, was the most dreaded.
Right, and she was white, completely white. It wasn't a spot.
And that meant it wasn't that you went to the hospital tent. It was you were banished from the camp.
That's right.
And you were left to die in the wilderness. It was a death sentence.
Right.
So,
but they threw themselves down, both Aaron and Moses, and...
So Aaron and Moses intervene, and God relents. So why...
But she still is sent for 7 days outside.
And the whole camp has to stop.
Yeah, which I thought was interesting too. That it made mention of that.
So why didn't Aaron get leprosy?
I don't know.
Why? What was he? Was he not complicit in it?
I don't know. I guess I didn't read it closely enough. What did you read?
He didn't.
Yeah.
No. I thought it was interesting. So,
but did it say why?
So Moses intercedes. It didn't say why.
Okay.
I don't know.
I was going to say I missed that.
So here's one of the most interesting things to me of the whole book is so the people continue to grumble. I mean, we're fast forwarding here, and they grumble, And even after God relents, even a day later, they're still grumbling and complaining. And God says that the anger of the Lord was kindled against these people. He comes to Moses and he says, I've had enough. Moses, step aside. I'm going to destroy these people. I'm going to make a great nation out of you.
Yes.
I'm going to start over again. And so what does Moses do? Well,
He has interceded so many times.
If you say so, who am I to question your inscrutable ways and whatever you say, sir? Is that what he did?
Nope, he intercedes.
So the most thing that I find so fascinating is that he reminds God that he should be doing the right thing. He goes on. This is Moses. Moses is talking. The one who talks to God face to face as a man talks to his friend.
Mm-hmm.
He goes to God and reminds him that he should be graceful, benevolent, kind, and forgiving, as if God had forgotten these things. And so Moses goes on and has this eloquent speech and talks about what will people think about you. Moses is concerned about what people will think about God.
Right.
What will the Egyptians think if you're not able to? You did all these miracles, you led them out of Egypt, and now you can't get this people out of this desert land and take them to their homeland? Well, I mean, they'll laugh at you. They won't think you're serious. They won't think you have any power. You'll look ridiculous.
Well, and interesting too, because it goes to not only just be merciful against your own people, but think about how these other people will look at you. And it's almost, I don't know if it's supposed to be a foreshadowing, but a foreshadowing that this is going to be a religion for all peoples. All are going to be welcome, and not just the Israelites later on.
The thing that I haven't understood, that troubles me about this, is that what was the promise that God made to Abraham?
That his people would be like the sand.
He promised that his descendants would ultimately produce Christ, that they would produce the Messiah. All of these, and when God makes a promise, can we count on it?
Yes.
So, let's say that Moses wouldn't have intervened,
right?
And let's say that God destroyed the children of Israel and started a new line through Moses.
Moses would still be in that line.
He would, but what about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob? What about Jacob's 12 sons? Because that was the promise that was made to them. So, how do you reconcile this?
Well,
because if he would have done that, let's say, what if Moses stepped aside and wouldn't have intervened and said, "As you wish, sir. Yes, very well, sir. We'll do just what your plan is." And would he really have destroyed the children of Israel, breaking the promise that he had made to Abraham?
Cannot imagine that he would have. So perhaps someone else, maybe Joshua comes along later as the leader, maybe he would have stepped up at that point to be the leader. Mm-hmm. Like, we don't know the circumstances. But maybe is this a test for Moses? Maybe is this to show the people? I
think you're honest. Is it a test for Moses? So God made a threat. Was he willing to carry that threat out? Or was it an idle threat?
May have been an idle threat.
And is it?
But I don't know that I don't like the terminology idle threat.
Okay.
Maybe this is kind of one of those questions to get people thinking. Maybe this is one of those. I don't think it was an idle threat, because I don't think I don't think the Lord dangles these things and I'm gonna hit you. I'm gonna kill you.
That's the way it reads, though. So is Moses more forgiving than God?
No.
But how do we reconcile this particular? I mean, it's quite a thing.
Well,
step aside, Moses. I'll destroy all of these people, children, everything. I'll make a great nation out of you. How else can you read it?
Well, did the Lord know that Moses was going to do this, and this was a way to show Moses' benevolence to the people?
I think so. I think it's very much like God asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. It violated everything that God had commanded. One thing that was not to be done was to sacrifice humans. And there, God's representative, Abraham, is asked to go and to violate all of the precepts of God, to violate everything that God had instructed him, and sacrifice his own son. Is it like that? Is there a lesson to come out of this? What is that lesson? How do we reconcile those two stories when God commands something that sounds very arbitrary and opposite to what he is and what he's taught in the past?
Yeah.
We'll have to read on.
I think the other thing that's interesting is right there is when they're going to enter the promised land. Because that's right when the spies were sent. And that's when they were going to enter the promised land.
Okay, right.
And Moses intercedes at that point. And he is just going to enter this promised land that he is so excited to go for. And he intercedes and is sent 40 years out. And he never gets to enter. Had he not interceded, would he have gotten to go into the promised land? Just throwing it out there.
Interesting.
But, timeline-wise,
So,
I don't know.
we send some spies out.
Right.
We send some spies out.
To check out.
Joshua, I believe, was amongst them.
Yes, Joshua and Caleb.
And so they're...
So 12 spies are out.
Send some spies out to reconnoiter and kind of see what's going on out there and what's this land that we're promised look like. Now, did God commission them to send the spies?
I think so.
Did they send it on their own, or was this God's plan? So the spies go out and they come back. Yeah. Some of them, they don't all agree. Some of them come back with a bad report. Some of them come back with a good report.
No, I wouldn't put it that way. I would say they had a good report, but they were afraid of that good report. Because everyone looked so healthy there. Everyone was so strong. Everyone would defeat them. They were like grasshoppers, I think was the terminology.
They stirred up the people.
And so I don't know that they didn't have a good report, but they maybe lied in their report.
No, the report was, we don't want to go down there.
We're terrified.
Those people are powerful. They have,
but I don't think they did deny the milk and honey.
No, they didn't deny any of that.
Yeah.
But they brought back. They said we best stay where we're at. If we go there, they'll slaughter us. Right. They're powerful people.
They did, except for two, Joshua and Caleb.
Joshua and Caleb say, no. Don't you know that God is with us? Don't you remember what He did with how He delivered us out of the hands of the Egyptians? Mm-hmm. And so we have this, and then again the people rebel, and God becomes angry again and says, none of you are going to go in.
Right, 40 years.
You're going to stay here 40 years until this generation completely dies out. Your children will inherit this land that I promised. Now, this doesn't sit well with a lot of the important people of Israel. And so we have these three men, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram.
Right.
Who are very prominent men in the camp.
I think they're all Levites.
Come from a good family.
And Korah, I think, is Moses' cousin, I read.
They gather together the most influential people, 150 princes, the Bible tells us. Mm-hmm. And they come and they say, who is this Moses? Are we not all blessed of God? They're challenging Moses' leadership.
They are. And they actually called Egypt the land of milk and honey, which I found fascinating. That's not really the land of milk and honey. You took us out of the land, mm-hmm. Which is really a slap.
So they challenge Moses' leadership, mm-hmm. and there's an elaborate ceremony set up with the censors, and they all come before the tent of meeting, and Moses speaks to the people and says, God's going to show us mm-hmm. who His chosen representative is, and everything's going to become clear here. And Moses says, I don't know if this comes from God or if this was something Moses thought up, said if they're in the wrong, let the earth swallow them up. And what happens?
Bye-bye.
But not only Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, but their families as well. Mm-hmm. Everything that they owned. Children, daughters, sons, wives, animals, livestock, tents, possessions, all of them. Were they all the families? Were the little ones complicit in Korah's sin?
No.
What type of a God would open up the earth and swallow up the innocent in front of the congregation? Is this the same God that Moses said there is no need to be afraid?
It is.
So, were the people afraid of God after watching this?
Yeah, they were.
What did they do the very next day? They came and they accused Moses of killing these people and continued to grumble. I can only imagine what this poor man must have had to go through.
Well, they were still questioning the priesthood and the power in the Levites.
So the very next day, after the earth opens up and swallows Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, God sends a plague upon the people. And people are falling by the hundreds, maybe the thousands. And the plague it almost gives the appearance that the plague is moving like a wave through the people. Mm-hmm. And Moses again steps in between the people and the plague and stays it. And the people are saved because of Moses' intervention. And the thing that I can't get away from, there isn't any answer here until we'll have to read on, is that it keeps appearing time after time that it is Moses that is pacifying God's anger. It is Moses that continues to interject with the people, and Moses looks more forgiving than God does in some of these stories. As difficult as that is to understand.
Yeah. Well, and I think, from our point of view, we can say, well, the Lord really wanted to establish Moses as the leader, as having the power, as being able to talk with me. So there's all these different things about.
So I was kind of wrestling with this, and that I couldn't get that out of my mind, and because, well, people will say, well, that's the God of the Old Testament, and it's the Father is much angrier than Jesus. Jesus is the God of the New Testament.
If you have seen me, you have seen my Father.
But when we go back and read the first book of John in the Gospel, we find out that it is Christ himself is the one that is leading, that is in the pillar of smoke and fire. It is Christ himself that created everything. It is Christ himself that parted the Red Sea and all these things. And read the first chapter, we'll find out that he was in the beginning. And he goes on to say, when the apostles came to Christ and said, show us the Father. What's Christ say? Say, what?
Yeah.
Why do you ask me to show you the Father? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I and the Father are one. So anyone who tries to draw a line between Old and New Testament and says, well, that's the angry, vengeful God of the Old Testament, and then we have Jesus, gentle Jesus, meek and mild in the New Testament. You can't do that. It's not scriptural. So here we have Jesus opening up the earth, swallowing Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, all their children, livestock, animals, and their possessions. How do we contrast that with the one who cried on the Mount of Olives over Israel? Did they? We're told it's the same person. How do we? What do we do with that?
How do we reconcile it?
How do we reconcile that?
Yeah.
One thing that was helpful to me is I went back and if you go back to the book of Nehemiah, there's a very long description. He's basically summarizing this entire wandering in the wilderness and from Egypt out to delivering them into the promised land. And you start to get some more insight on how stiff-necked and how rebellious these people were and how much they despised the thing that God, how they took care of it. Because the matter of fact is that they were there 40 years. Did they want for food?
No.
Clothing?
No.
Protection?
No.
Did they have everything that they possibly needed?
Yeah.
Was there anything that they really needed to complain about?
No.
Said that there was no sickness. Would you like to live in a world with no sickness?
Wonderful.
Said their clothing never wore out. Mm-hmm. Would you like to never have to buy clothing again?
Mm-hmm.
Said there were never any stillbirths or any birth defects or anything like that. Would you like to live in a world like that? They were provided for, that you could go to sleep at night and not worry about anything. And granted, living in the wilderness was not the ideal. God had something much better planned for them. But even in that state of their sin and rebellion and constantly being ungrateful and constantly turning away from the things that he was trying to teach them, did he abandon them and make them go hungry?
No.
Did he make them suffer and freeze and go without?
No.
He didn't. So
I think one thing too, when you talk about Old Testament and New Testament God, is that it is so much easier to talk about, to understand someone in your presence. So when Jesus is in your presence, it's easier to have a relationship, to say, oh, such and such. But here, even though God is with them in the tabernacle, it's not that same intimate relationship. Mm-hmm. It's not seeing the expressions on the face. And you also have different authors writing. and their language choices, their language styles, our perception of what they're writing, very different time periods when they're writing, how they wrote. All of these things influence what is presented.
It's true. But the Bible also tells us that all Scripture is written by a holy man and all comes from God. God essentially is taking responsibility for everything in the 66.
Well, I agree, but there's also contextual and historical time periods, and we write very differently now than they wrote back then,
Certainly.
even if we're writing the same story of exactly what happened.
And just because it's in here in a story, it doesn't mean that it always means that God condones it. You don't have
Right.
someone, one of the Old Testament characters, doing something that is just deplorable, and God's stamp of approval. Well done.
Right. Sometimes it happened.
Well done to the Levite who cut his concubine into 12 pieces and sent her
Right.
limbs out to the 12 tribes. There is no mention, there is no sanction from God of that. It's simply a record of this is what happened.
Right.
Yeah, there's so many more. There's so much more in this that we only got halfway through it. I think that we should do another part and cover the second part of Numbers, because the importance of Moses' sin and why he didn't enter into the land of Canaan, I think, is so we'll do. We don't have a timeline here, so reread the second half of the book of Numbers,
Okay.
and we'll pick that up, Lord willing, next week, and don't be. I mean, this whole thing, it kind of seems like it's ending on a very down note, and you start to maybe have some questions about, well, this when you bring up these questions, these are hard questions, hard things to understand. But the thing that we're going to continue to say is we need to read on. We'll continue to read on, and it's going to get harder. It's going to get worse. There's going to be questions that are even more difficult than some of these, and we'll read on. And we're going to look, and when we get to the end, hopefully we can have some resolution on this and have a better understanding of why this was necessary. And one last thing in closing I'll say that comes to mind is that God is basically instructing children out here. And if we have a child that is going down the wrong path and going to something that's going to be very destructive to him, we can continue to speak to him very calmly. We can not pose any penalties. We can always be nice and kind and gentle. But there might become a time where it's no longer effective. And the only thing that this child will respond to is an escalation, whether that be a tone or starting to implement punishments. It's the only thing that you can do to keep this child from going down the wrong way until finally they can begin to agree with you and understand and make those decisions. So God has a plan for Israel. God has a plan for the human, what's the word I'm looking for?
Race?
For the human race. And these people won't listen to him. And they won't participate in this plan that will ultimately save everyone. And not only that, but reunite them back to him in the kingdom. And so God continues to have to escalate and escalate and escalate. And it's sad that and I'm not just going to pick on the children of Israel, because we're the same today as they were. We are so rebellious and so willing to walk away and to run away from God that we leave him no choice but to do whatever it takes to get our attention. And that may be opening up the earth and swallowing a few people. That may be thundering on Sinai. He's willing to run the risk of frightening people, scaring people, making them think that he is arbitrary, angry, and severe, to get their attention, because what is at stake is so important. It's eternal life. So I try to keep that in mind when we get to these difficult stories. Let's not just focus on this and take them out of context, but let's set these things aside and we'll come back to them, and hopefully we'll get a better understanding that why God had to do what we did. Because what happens to me when I go through this is I start to see God very differently, and I start to become sympathetic to how difficult a job he has to get us back into the family. So I guess we'll close with that. All right. Well, join us in prayer if you would. Dear Father, we thank you for this opportunity to speak to your people. We just pray for your peace and blessings upon everyone in attendance. Help us to understand these difficult stories. We want to know the truth, and we want to know why you've had to do the things you've done, and we just ask for truth and guidance is all we seek. As these favors and blessings in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.